Ironically, as we mentioned before, present young Earth creationism would view other young Earth Christians from the past as having a compromised understanding of Scripture. So even though young Earth creationism claims a long pedigree within the church, it doesn't take long from a historical perspective to find individuals that hold young Earth views who nonetheless would have a biblical interpretation of Genesis that would sit at radical odds with what Ken Ham is proposing. So Augustine would have been a geocentrist because of his time and place, but he also held to a non-literal, what we would consider a non-literal understanding of Genesis. He held to a young Earth, because everyone did back in that time, that evidence for the antiquity of the Earth did not come until later in the 1700s. But despite this, Augustine held that all of creation was accomplished in an instant, so that God instantly created everything, and that Genesis was written with the form it has in order to be a theological exposition of what was actually going on. So we don't see this type of view commonly represented in the church any longer. But as we look back in church history, we see that these views were there. So here's one of the church fathers, Origen, writing about Genesis. He says, for who that has understanding will suppose that the first, second, and third day, and the evening and the morning existed without a sun, and a moon, and stars, and that the first day was, as it were, also without a sky? And who is so foolish to suppose that God, after the manner of a husbandman, planted a paradise in Eden toward the east, and placed in it a tree of life, visible and palpable, so that one tasting of its fruit by bodily teeth obtained life, and again, that one was a partaker of good and evil by masticulating what was taken from the tree? And if God is said to walk in the paradise in the evening, and Adam to hide himself under a tree, I do not suppose that anyone doubts that these things figuratively indicate certain mysteries, the history having taken place in appearance and not literally. So interestingly here we have a young Earth creationist church father, because everybody was young Earth creationist back then, nonetheless taking a view of Genesis that is radically opposed to young Earth creationists in the present day. So Origen is compromised. One of the things that I hope you take away from this talk is that the recent categories that are most loudly promoted, none of those categories can claim sort of uninterrupted tenure within the church as a theological model for how we interpret the opening chapters of the Bible.